Okay. Oh, Andy, which one is your bottle?
You get first shot at it.
I know I'm going to struggle with opening this later, and it's going to be awkward, so I'm just trying to make sure. All right. Well, just to reiterate what Olga said, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. I know like pizza is really enticing, but coming to talk about something that means a lot to me and Andy is also a really nice gesture, and I appreciate that. To anybody at home watching, thank you as well. We know you have plenty of options to watch tonight, one being pretty much Disney Plus. So thank you for coming to watch us instead. And then to those who are watching the recording in the future, Disney Plus, I think you'll probably know it now as the Federation of Disney. You're probably taken over by that. But thank you for watching as well. So, and of course, thanking VML-Y&R for hosting this event. For those who don't know, VML-Y&R is a global brand engagement and marketing firm. So we have places all over the globe. It's everywhere you want to be. Trademark, I think. So I don't know if I can say that, but I did. The idea for VML-Y&R is creating connected brands. So no longer is everybody just necessarily loyal to one singular brand, and that's not the expectation for anybody to just have one place you go to for all your needs necessarily. The idea is to create a continuity between the different clients and brands and to give a better portrait of who you are as an individual and create these brands that are connected together. We do so by trying to leverage creativity, technology through the lens of culture, okay? By doing that, we feel like it's probably the best way to maximize profit, obviously as a business, but to really engage the clients and the world overall and garner some kind of impact in a meaningful and positive way. On that note, tonight we're here to talk about accessibility. Test it. All right, thank you. Enjoy the pizza. That's it. That's all we're doing. Seriously, no. The idea tonight is not the traditional fanfare associated with accessibility. Like we can go and talk about the definition of accessibility. We talk about the standards. We can talk about like the noble cause of doing what's right. But you guys have made the conscious choice here tonight to come here and learn more, to expand your horizons. And so the concept is not to focus on what we can go look up on the internet. Now, while we'll talk about some like hardcore standards for accessibility needs, the idea is maybe to focus more on a more active role when it comes to accessibility. Okay, so from here on out, we're all considered allies. Right? The term is derived from accessibility and conveniently the 11 letters in between. I count them out. I did. It's really weird. But being an ally suggests a more active role in accessibility, especially when it comes to development and design. Okay, and that's key here because right now, when we talk about the current state of the world, it's pretty much what drove you guys here tonight. Pizza, Domino's, right? Everybody probably expects us to talk about it quite a bit. But here's the problem with that concept. If we look at this very simple diagram that I put together yesterday, Domino's is dominating the conversation on accessibility, right? All of our time, our interest, and our energy is going into talking about what they did wrong, right? By the time we get exhausted with that, we then maybe talk about other pizza companies and how they're doing things right. And then we talk to maybe stuff that's kind of pizza related, like Ninja Turtles, right? That's great. And then we eventually maybe get to non-pizza related topics, which should be the overall theme, right? We don't want to improve accessibility measures because we want Domino's to be happy, right? We do that as allies in order to encompass inclusion and to help out everybody on a grander scale, right? Not just for Domino's. And so tonight we're going to focus more on an inversion of that concept. Okay? Instead of spending all of our time and energy in terms of what's going wrong, focus on what's going right and focus on the instant feedback that we can rely on in order to deal with accessibility as not a challenge, but an opportunity to innovate. And that's important because instead of wasting all of our energy, focus on where things have gone wrong and what happened on CNN, right? We focus on the actual issue, right? Trying to include individuals. But before we can do that, we need to discuss generally what we consider to be disabilities, right? Our standard portrait of disabilities involves some categories. right? Ones that you're probably familiar with: visual, being blind, being colorblind, having low vision. That's one that we tend to think about when we think about accessibility testing. Auditory, so dealing with being deaf or having hard hearing. Physical as well, the inability to use a keyboard or to have to use a mouse only. People that maybe have different types of limitations physically, they might get tired or they have tremors. Cognitive, this is the ability to really perceive the information that you're taking, and so making sure you're not confusing your customers or your users. Then neurological, which is a little bit harder to define between cognitive. So neurological is more the physical and biological backings of how you take in that information. So things like maybe like having seizures. Sorry, what?
I actually have a neurological disability. I got a concussion a few months ago. So if I'm watching something with a lot of motion or a lot of animation, or like the screen changes over too much, then I start getting dizzy and aggravated.
And then see,
So
that's
it's
not
a processing thing.
yeah.
I can see it.
It's not necessarily a cognitive disability, right? It's you're understanding what you're seeing, but it's a neurological, like biological response that you have no control over, and it's not garnered from your society and your culture.
No.
Right? It's just something that happened,
Yep.
right? And then there's speech. So people that are unable to talk, or maybe that have a thick accent, or who just through maybe social anxiety don't want to speak, right? Which leads into the other cog of this general portrait that we have of severity and duration, okay? So a couple of different ways to think about it. The ones that we're familiar with are things that maybe are progressive disabilities, so maybe getting older, right? Or permanent ones, people that may have been disabled at birth or have been in an accident, can no longer use their hand, for example. But we also need to consider situational, temporal, and technological disabilities. These are more circumstantial, but some ways to think about it, say you're in, Holden, Missouri, where the internet connection is very, very shaky, right? We want to consider that also in terms of our disability portrait, because that's a technological impairment that they have no control over, right? When we talk about situational ones, so maybe you're outside, and it's very bright outside, and you're trying to use your phone or try to use your screen, and you can't just because of the way the sun is shining, and it makes it very difficult to see the monitor. Those are all temporal and situational disabilities that we don't really consider when we look at the situation as a whole in this regard, right? And so we have these two colleagues that are just working together, and it's designing a portrait of disability that has really quarantined the subset into a user base that we maybe think as a cherry on top of our reach, right, in our engagement. W3C brought out a really good point. So first, the quote: 1 billion people, about 15% of the world population, will have to deal with some kind of disability in one form or another, right? Well, this is impactful enough, okay? You're looking at maybe $1 billion worth of revenue, or sorry, not almost, I think it was $1 trillion, sorry. $1 trillion worth of revenue. This is not the full picture, right? Statistically speaking, as people get older, they will start to acquire disabilities, but because they were never in that community before, and they just think it's just part of the aging process, they will never identify themselves as disabled. So while this is a daunting number, 1 billion people, it's likely understated, okay? In the US alone, disability income and disposable income accounts for about like $500 billion, right? And that's just immediate, okay? If you talk about families and immediate friends, that number gets up into the trillions, all right? And so no longer are we considering this a small problem, right? When we want to engage people, they're not just some subset anymore. They are people that are just every day, and you will see them, right? It's not just some quarantine extra cherry on top. So the real portrait needs to be more inclusive, right? We want to start doing things in a broader sense, just like we talked about inverting the discussion from what's going wrong and focusing on what's going right, spending our energy there first. Focusing on the idea of engaging people with disabilities as a side effect of being innovative is really the best way to unlock any type of innovative blockers in your development life cycle. What I mean by this is if you focus on creating multiple platforms, creating robust user experiences, focus on something as simple as cross-browser testing, you're engaging your normal clientele, but as a side effect, you are also benefiting those that have disabilities, whether it's temporal or permanent. Focusing on just the categories and the severity of disabilities leads to a situation where you no longer treat that problem as necessary and a priority. But if you expand the concept and focus on just being innovative as a general cross foundation and mindset, you start to see how it will affect them, but also your brand value, right? Being a website that is catering towards people of all walks of life makes you recognizably better and more valuable as a brand. You're more engaging, you're more positive, you're more inclusive. This leads to increased brand loyalty, obviously increased brand image, and one that we don't really think about is actually the employees, right? If we go into a process and we don't take into consideration the needs of people that may have temporal or permanent disabilities, we lead to rework, right? Which means repeating your job. And a lot of people, they love their job, but they don't want to do the same thing that they just spent all that time in and doing again. So being aware of being innovative and taking accessibility as a mindset can have some really impacting values as well. The other thing to kind of bring this a little bit more outside of the tech space is the idea of how disability is really just an idea of necessity, right? It's a challenge, it's an opportunity. And so when we focus on disabilities and trying to overcome those needs and to account for them, we lead to some things that we now take for granted and that were originally designed for people with disabilities. One of the examples that I liked in my research of this was the idea of a countess who was trying to hide her affair, and she was blind. At the time, it was tradition for someone that was blind to dictate their letter to someone to write it, but it's an affair. She couldn't go public with that. So her and her lover put together one of the first versions of a typewriter, created a tactile solution to overcome it, but it wound up being something that benefits everybody, right? The email idea came from one of the founders of the internet. His wife is deaf, and he was looking for a nice digital electronic way to communicate with her, and that began the foundations for email, right? While we may begin with a concept of disability and trying to solve a problem there, ultimately this benefits everybody. And a lot of other reasons too. We see captioning. Everybody, I watch Netflix with captions on, right? I'm proud of that, right? Anime, sub people, anyone?
K-dramas.
A couple. Okay, speech recognition. We're starting to see that with a lot of home devices as well, okay? Voice to text using screen readers is also something that is disability-minded, but did not stop there, right? Instead, it looked at it as an opportunity to innovate and to expand the reach, right? If you were to design something super cool and innovative, it would be a fool's errand to try to not use that in every way possible and as efficiently as possible, right? You want to share that with the world. That is the focus here. And so instead of focusing on disability as an obstacle, we see it as an opportunity to maybe overcome some challenges and to benefit people overall in terms of improving the user experiences. With that in mind, we have to then focus on the necessity of the developer lifecycle. I'll hand it over to Andy to talk about that portion.
All right, thanks, John. You did an awesome job of laying the groundwork for how we kind of conceive of developing with accessibility in mind here at BNL Y&R. And also for this idea that with this presentation, we kind of want to take some of the ways that accessibility and designing for disability is perceived in the world now and flip it on its head, muddy the waters a little bit, challenge some of that status quo. So with that in mind, let's dig into how we measure the accessibility of a site and how we test for that. Okay, so here's how it often happens. The software development lifecycle starts with planning before design. It moves into development, content creation and entry. And then once something is in a more or less finished state, then testers think about accessibility. Obviously, that's not what we want to do. Testers are an integral part of making sure that sites and software are accessible, but we are by no means the gatekeeper. So we are going to talk about the checklist that you have in front of you a little bit later. All of those criteria fall into 4 kind of categories, overarching categories. So the first one is perceivable. Can I see information across a variety of ways of doing that, whether that's, typical looking at a desktop screen or with a screen reader, for instance. Operable. So can I interact with those elements on a page in a way that makes sense? Understandable. A good example of this, one that might drive home how important it is, if I'm using a screen reader to interact with, for example, a checkout screen on a site, do I know when I'm entering my credit card information versus making a note on a transaction? So you can see how it's sensitive information, something being understandable is really critical. And then robust, is my experience similar across those modes of interacting with it? Are there any questions so far? Okay, so to return to the idea of the software development lifecycle and to break down some of the barriers of accessibility with design. Okay, so we talked about core, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. I'm going to open it up to the floor. Which of those categories do you think come into play in the design portion of this cycle? Selena knows the answer. I want to say. Cheating. Any ideas?
Perceivable.
Perceivable, right. So one of the things that becomes important with design are things like color contrast. That's a huge issue, making sure that, and there are recognized standards for that. So for small text versus large text, we need to make sure that we're not doing something like, for example, light gray text on a white background. It's going to be hard for pretty much anyone to see. Operable. Can I, is a site laid out in such a way that it makes sense? Is content that is important not hidden somewhere in a menu or otherwise? Okay, development. Any ideas here? Okay.
I've already forgotten what the other 2 are.
So perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So with development, we're thinking about a lot of things. With development, a lot of the issues that come up, and there are a lot, you can see there are 58 items in your checklist, but some of the most common problems are things like tabbing through a site in an order that makes sense. And we'll get to that, we'll dig in a little bit more later. Screen readers know that elements are there, often by having either alternate text, so in an image, it's text that describes that image if I can't see it, or something called an ARIA label that announces what it's doing. You can also have roles, so if it's a form, for instance. Okay. Content. So content and development often work hand in hand, where developers could, for instance, I mentioned alternate text. They might make a image component that requires alternate text. Maybe they enter it themselves, or maybe that's in the purview of a content creator. But in any case, they're working together to make sure that when we're looking at a website, we can interact with it in a variety of modes. Okay, in testing, I saved the full 4 letters for us because I had to, but really, robust is across all of these phases in the life cycle. Okay, so the impact if we don't bake these criteria, these things into the software development lifecycle are huge. John mentioned the Domino's lawsuit that went all the way to the Supreme Court. There's time and money lost, not just in fighting lawsuits, hopefully, but also in reworking your site to make it accessible. One of the ways that I like to conceive of this, though, is with actual architecture. There's a lot of parallels with software architecture. I also had to kind of throw this in because this is my alma mater. This is North Kansas City High School, just 5 minutes away, that recently did pretty much a whole new school added onto our old building, which is almost 100 years old. So the way it used to be, if you needed to use an elevator for whatever reason to get around, you had to go to a back corner of the building, go down a janky old elevator, come back into the main part of the building. So you had to kind of sequester yourself. You weren't part of the main flow. Now I got to go into the new building. You can see the staircase here in the middle, and the elevator is right there with it. So where everybody is moving around, you have some choices in modes of transportation. There's also an interesting point. So the reason I was there was for a concert, and the band room now is designed so that where double doors happen, there's not a column in between. So not only is that good for getting timpanis and big band equipment in and out, but it's good design for anyone who might be in a wheelchair, might have other sorts of equipment with them. That's to John's point that with software, with buildings, good architecture is good architecture. When we design for accessibility, we're designing things well in general. And this also kind of points to a point about the legality of all of this. So in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act established equal access to public spaces. And then that was expanded about 10 years later to include online spaces for federal agencies. So kind of this recognition that we're having a blurred experience now in our lives between the physical and the online. So much of our lives are conducted now, not just in places like schools and parks, but also social media, Netflix, Disney Plus, whatever. Let's see. Any other questions so far? So this is what the software development lifecycle should really be conceptualized as. Accessibility as the hub of a cycle. Cool.
So to piggyback off of what Andrea is bringing up about the idea of litigation, and so going back and calling, hopefully you guys remember the idea of dominoes and leading down to non-pizza related stuff, and instead we want to invert that, right? The idea is to not focus on avoiding litigation as your primary reason for doing innovation and doing development. Right, that's a horrible way to do that, right? If you are driving around with just the sole purpose of avoiding car wrecks, you're going to miss out on a lot of things that might be enjoyable things of driving, right? That's not the point. And so in order to really engage that and to entertain that thought, we need to eventually take a more active role and develop what's right now going through the patent process. I call it access sense. I'm not really patenting this. When we talk about access and being aware of it, if you think back to the idea of construction, it was so out of the ordinary to see a wheelchair ramp, to see a disabled or an accessibility door that had an automated opening on it. It was also odd to see elevators. Elevators were kind of relegated to architecture that could afford it, and it was like a nice luxury to have. And it became weird seeing ramps, seeing elevators, seeing doors that open when you press the button. And it was odd for a little bit, right? But now we see them everywhere, and it's not odd, right? We don't question it anymore, okay? Another example, guys in the room, the short urinal in the bathroom. Like we all avoid it, right? Because it's there for a purpose, right? But we don't question it anymore. It doesn't seem weird. Developing a sense of access awareness begins with the idea of recognizing the stimuli around you and how you evaluate it. So whenever you're walking around, you don't pay attention to your shoes anymore. Why? Because they're not hurting you, they're not causing any massive impact in the way that you're consuming the world around you. And so then we filter it out, right? If it is affecting us, like say maybe a dog stole our shoe, right? We're gonna notice the new stimuli. It's gonna impact the way that we are behaving, and then we actually have a reaction. So by nature, it's not our fault that we kind of ignore all the unimportant stuff, right? It's only when it becomes important to us that suddenly everybody seems to care, right? Like Christopher Reeves, when he went through his accident and became paralyzed, he suddenly became a huge proponent of accessibility, right? That's because he didn't have to pay attention to it until then, right? So we do not focus on wheelchair ramps or elevators or just white noise in the area until it becomes something of an issue for us. And as I brought up before, as we go through our lives and age, disability becomes something that we may have to face, right? And it's only when they seem to maybe be useful that we maybe notice. And so understanding how we take in the world around us is part of being aware of that and taking that first step, because if we want to be accessibly minded, we also have to start making a conscious choice now until it becomes muscle memory. right? And so as a developer, as a tester, it's super, super sad and annoying when you hear people kick back an idea or a violation to you with the idea of, is there a ticket for it, right? Unless it's impacting them and they don't have a way to measure that little change, they seem to not care, right? That's a horrible mindset to have, right? It should be something natural and something that occurs to all of us as we go through the process. And so when doing some quick Google foo, I came across an accessibility consultant, Carl Groves, who put it in a really nice way. When we talk about our cars and you get out of your car, right, you have all your stuff on you, what's the next thing you do? You lock your car, right? Not just because we're in Kansas City, right, or Independence, because it's just the thing you do now. Regardless of where you go, even at your home, you'll lock your car. It becomes muscle memory, right? At first, it probably seemed odd when you got your car to have a change and make that new habit of consciously locking your door because it benefited you, right? And then it just became part of your process, right? So no longer should we focus on like the idea of like, maybe accessibility and development costs us more time and resources. The focus of getting it across the board in the whole development life cycle instead creates a mindset where it's now muscle memory or digital memory, if you will. It shouldn't be a question of, do we do this now and our choices when we do development? It should just be something that happens, which may lead to maybe some incremental changes in terms of resource and time engagement. But as Annie was bringing up earlier, the impact of not being accessibly minded will cascade through all points of the development life cycle, okay? That measurably will cost time and money, right? And something that we need to keep in mind of. But being accessibly aware begins as a conscious choice. There's no magic switch, okay? It's not gonna be something that you just walk away from this and know about. It's gonna be an active choice. It's gonna be a practice. And that is the hard part about this, and the real reality is that we have to make that improvement. Doing development is the new kind of architecture. And for a while, when we talk about physical buildings, it seemed odd to not have an elevator shaft, or it seemed odd to have an elevator shaft, and then it became natural, right? We're now in a spot where we're having a bit of a renaissance with digital development as well. We have to start invoking the idea of accessibility in all of our practices. And so in order to do that, we'll kind of start with a nice baseline. And so as Annie brought before, the WCAG 2.1, and there's also 2.0, which is the general standard of how we approach things. So a quick reminder again of the core idea, right? So the four pillars of it. So within the checklist, you guys can see how they all fall into it. But the one thing to keep in mind is with the 2.1 version that came out, it introduced mobile guidelines. Or something we didn't have to deal with for a while because touchscreens weren't a thing, right? But now everybody has a phone, everybody has tablets, and they're everywhere. And so we have to consider things like maybe our dwell time when we put a notification up on a website, making sure that that's there long enough for somebody who's navigating maybe by voice or by tabbing has time to respond, right? Making sure that our buttons are laid out in a way that is somebody that has Parkinson's won't have difficulty clicking on the button they intend to. Making sure our icons are clear and not abstract so that when somebody has a cognitive disability, they understand that this is a search button, right? Or this is a login button. These kind of choices are new and we didn't have to deal with them before, but now we do because it's just there, right? It's not a question of making it a feature, an enhancement. It's a necessity. So, ideally, we develop what I like to call accessibility smell, right? And while we're gonna go through a couple of softwares and plugins that will help out for being accessibly minded, it's really important to know that these are not perfect, okay? Despite what any of them will tell you, right? They will always miss something. That's something you don't wanna be caught off of, okay? So while you take these into consideration, first and foremost, you are the final product of looking for accessibility compliance. So with that being said, the first thing we need to do when we're dealing with accessibility is to create more of a relatable experience, right? We can talk about how noble it is to maybe help people that have limited mobility, but then also to create what that means and something that is measurable and instant is important for the whole process to actually work. And so we'll go over a couple of ways to emulate disabilities. The first one is gonna be Web Disability Simulator, and then Chrome Lens, and then Total. And we'll get into all three of them. So Web Disability Simulator is pretty much what it says. And so here's just a screen capture of what's going on. It is just a Chrome plugin, and when you activate it, it gives you an option to initiate some kind of disability that would be pretty common, actually. So this first one is an example of a situation where someone might be outside and sunlight's way too bright. And this is what your website would look like with that kind of bleached look. The nice thing about all three of these plugins is that it allows you to still navigate through your website so you can enjoy or not the website as somebody who's out and it's really, really bright, okay? One really cool thing about Web Disability Simulator is it does also do some of the physical disabilities. So this one is emulating Parkinson's or just general muscle tremors. And so notice how difficult it is for this user to click on these middle buttons here because it's just jittery, right? The initiative, the solution here is to space those buttons out so you give a little bit of a margin of error. Now granted, it was probably like 3 in the morning when I was taking this recording, but everybody can benefit from that, okay? It's not just people that have permanent disability. One of my favorite ones for this is actually trying to emulate concentration deficit, okay? It seems a bit silly, but if you notice how the information is grouped on this web page, and you see these distractions coming in, and they're immediately blocking consumption of some of this information. That is a physical manifestation or representation of what it would be like to have some type of attention deficit disorder, right? And it's something to keep in mind when you're trying to make your website. You want to give information in small, parsed out bits of information and not overwhelm your users. Something to keep in mind. Any questions about this plugin? Do we have any questions on the stream, Olga?
No questions so far.
No? Teaching them everything they need to know.
Yep, you're doing good.
The next plugin is Chrome Lens. Chrome Lens is actually really, really wonderful for a couple of reasons, which we're about to go over. So the first one, just like a Web Disability Simulator, it will emulate different types of blindness. And so here you can see a couple of different versions. So I go with medium because that's how me and my brother would see the website if we didn't have glasses. He doesn't wear his, so this is how he sees right now the presentation.
Thanks.
So if you guys wanted to understand that, the old TJ scope, right? That's the only reason I invited you, TJ. Just you're my talking point.
But
One of the other things that this simulator also does is like just general color blindness. So you can immediately check your color palette choices and provide feedback to the design team. Okay, that's important because a lot of times we relegate all of our accessibility testing, as Andy showed, into the last parts of the development cycle when everything's been done, right? If we can provide feedback immediately and using some simple tools like this, you can prevent those things from becoming massive and expensive reworks. The other really exciting functionality is the ability to trace how tabbing works on a website. So you just activate it and it draws a red line to every tab spot you do, right? You can then save this as a screenshot. There's a functionality to do it. And then you can immediately send that off also to your design team or your development team and say, look, the way you're organizing your stuff, your components, does not make sense. Now, granted, this is Craigslist, and it's just a whole bunch of links, but the point is still there. Now, so let us loop back around and see if you can find a mistake already with Craigslist here. What happened?
it's straight to calendar days.
It went straight to the calendar days?
I mean,
Well, it starts here at the search bar, right?
Yeah.
What am I immediately missing?
How do you get to the creative posting? That's
Creating a post and my account, accessing those two things are missed, which means that whoever is going through this website by tab has to go through all of this before they get to it, right? That's horrible, right? And that's probably the worst misconnection on Craigslist, right? Now, you can take both of these concepts and layer them together. You turn on full blindness, which just makes it all blacked out, and you do the same tabbing process, But now you don't have the noise of the website, and you can show immediately what that path looks like to somebody who would have to use a keyboard experience for the website. That is something you can do immediately and give to your team as feedback. Any questions on this one? When you activate it, it becomes a tab under the development tools as well, which makes it very easy and super inexcusable for a development team not to use. Right? It's right there, right next to them. No excuses. The final one is one of my favorites, totally. Okay, it is totally, but with the ally derivative that we talked about before with the ones. So it is made by Khan Academy individuals who made just a JavaScript that you set as a bookmark on your browser. And when you click it, it creates this small glasses button down here that when you expand it, it gives you a couple of different filters to engage the idea of accessibility. And so this is applying them across the board, and you can see how it gives you feedback. And so right now it is showing a screen reader wand, which is one of my favorite components of this. It shows what a screen reader would possibly say when someone is trying to consume the website. Now, this is a key point because when you talk to developers about doing screen reader testing, the number one complaint is they don't want to sit there and listen to a robo voice over and over and over and over. This way, it shows what the screen reader will read without them having to listen to it. Now, granted, that doesn't replace doing it verbally, but it does give them at least a little bit of a sanity relief, okay? The nice thing about Totally is that it highlights, as you saw before, all the violations, and then it gives a couple of suggestions on how to fix it immediately. So someone who is using it from a development standpoint can immediately turn it on, see their website, interact with it, and then get ways to fix it before it becomes a problem, before it even gets pushed up to the repo. You can sit there and make improvements, and it's not hard, right? The key tonight is to try to get rid of all those obstacles that people are using to say, hey, we don't want to do accessibility improvements. Like, this is not something that's difficult. It's free. Everybody can install it on their browsers right now. So we take all of these and we try to combine them into the realm of manual testing overall. With that, we'll pass it off to Andy, who's going to go a little bit more in depth about how we can apply some of this software and get actual results.
Cool, yeah, so let's go through kind of a workflow if you were a tester with a website that you were in charge of looking at for accessibility. What would that look like? Okay, so one of the things we want to do is the idea that along with manual testing, it'll never just be one thing that you use. You'll have your experience, that's your accessibility notes that you've got. You'll have all of these browser plugins. I'll show you a few more in addition to demonstrating some more with the ones that John mentioned already. And there are even ones that you can kick off automatically as part of a continuous integration or continuous delivery process. So here are some of the things we're going to talk about now. Let's start with keyboard navigation. And I am going to use, for the purpose of demonstration, a website. And I kind of plugged this on my LinkedIn account. I said, we want to talk about what happens when you can't use your typical computer experience to, for instance, pay your cable bill, if you're a dinosaur like me and still have cable. So let's use this Spectrum TV website as our test site. Let's say that you got here by Googling, and this is not probably an uncommon Google, pay my bill Spectrum. So that's how I found this page. Step one, let's just check it out. So I'll do a slow scroll. If you have a computer with you or a mobile device, you can pull this up. It's the help section, pay my bill. So just take a look, see what we've got going on here. It's not a huge website. Let's scroll down to the bottom. And you will need your checklist here. Okay, and that's it. So once we've got kind of a feel for what's going on in this page, we're looking at your checklist. What are some of the things that you might be sensitive to on this page, given some of those criteria you see in front of you? Does anything jump out? Yeah.
Maybe skip to content, because like the main column has big video.
Yeah.
And if you're don't wanna deal with the video, just want the facts. Like I wouldn't notice the table of contents on the right,
Right.
I automatically block out the right side. So it was like, okay, where is everything at this, your last scroll and find what you want.
And in fact, we will see a skip to content thing once we start navigating. Anything else that jumps out? You mentioned the video. There are a couple of criteria there that mention how we should be able to like experience videos in alternative ways. Okay,
I mean, I'm assuming that's a caption.
it is a caption. Yep, I turned them on already.
Okay.
Okay. So I'll usually start by tabbing through the site, and John showed you what that tab trace looks like. Here's what it looks like for this site. I already ran it so that we didn't have to sit through the whole thing. What we're looking for here is a logical tab order. So is the content presented in a logical way? What do you guys think?
No.
No? How come?
Well, depends on who you are, but
The video kind of offsets, be logical.
yeah,
And everything looks logical until you get to the
Yeah,
video.
okay.
The
Not
sign
that-
in, the sign in.
Yep, we're
Sign
missing
in
a
is
link up
skipped.
there. The Spectrum logo is also a link that we skip over. Otherwise, we don't have too many crossed wires, so to speak. We aren't like jumping between portions of the page, which is good. I see that a bunch of these links are tabbable, which is also good. I also like that there is in fact an accessibility link on Spectrum's website, which is pretty cool. You don't often see that, but it's cool if it's in the forefront of their minds. Okay, so after we tab through and kind of get a feel for what's going on there, let's do it ourselves. So I'm just gonna start up here in the URL bar and start tabbing through, and there's that skip to main content option that is only visible once you tab in, so that's kind of nice. If I press enter, and the common controls if you're only using a keyboard are enter space, John mentioned shift tab will go backwards a tab, and then of course the arrow keys. So if I skip to main content, now I am somewhere. This is kind of interesting. Do you guys see where my cursor is? You see that pink focus indicator?
and
So I'll keep tabbing here until it, oh. Now I'm in the video. So it must have popped onto the video. Okay. So that's interesting.
it didn't really look like it actually skipped much except for maybe the headers, because your first tab was straight to edit.
Yeah. Yeah, and there is in fact, so if I come back here and start over again, and instead of skipping content, I'll just keep going. You guys will see, so you see where the focus is. After this point, disappears.
Huh.
There's probably some hidden content that's pretty common, but it means that my cursor is now focused somewhere that I don't know. And the next one is edit. So that would be one small point to make to a development team, for instance.
It looks like it focused on Ask Spectrum.
Oh, you might be right. Yeah, I think it did. Okay, let's see. Enter. Cool. So it did. I just jumped down there. Thanks. Okay, so a couple of other common things to look at. We mentioned this edit. This opens what's called a modal. So it's kind of part of the page, kind of not. This can be what's called a keyboard trap. So I want to be able to get into this and back out of this, not get stuck. So let's see if I can. I'll change this to 64116. Okay, so if I entered something, it worked. Another one, let's make sure I can move around the menu here. Okay, good, I'm back tabbing and I'm out, that's nice. Okay, so at this point, I would do this probably through the whole site and try to open things and close things and make sure I wasn't stuck. One thing that we will do quickly, because it can get kind of loud, I'm gonna turn on my screen reader. So common screen readers include, the one built into my Mac is VoiceOver. You can get there by hitting Command F5, I wanna say. NVDA is one for Windows, and then a common one for Chrome is a plugin called Chromevox. I'm going to enable it now and you'll hear it. Maybe. Okay, so we'll go through, let me start us actually. Okay, I'm gonna start us here. So the point of this page, right, is learning how to pay my bills. Let's find out if I can do that with a screen reader on this page. Okay. If I can control the video, I won't right now. Okay. So this is kind of cool. So if that was using the keyboard. Okay, so this is one of those criteria, right? Can I add captions? Yes. Okay, now we'll get to the meat of things. Okay, so if you were only seeing this site, and I could have turned on the Chrome lens full blindness to really get the full picture, but if you only had your screen reader and needed to know these 4 steps to pay your bill, are you leaving that with an experience that you know how to do that now? Not really. It announced the links to sign in and use a primary admin account, set up recurring payments, but as for the steps in between, nothing. So this is a good moment to kind of point out, we didn't want to get too much into the weeds of like the development considerations here, but with old HTML, certain HTML elements are readable basically by a screen reader. Those include links. I have them somewhere written down.
Padding.
Padding, that's an attribute. Input, object, select text area, and button. Most websites are made out of a bunch of divs, if you know, you've done much of web development. And so they're not automatically found by a screen reader. You have to do things to them. You have to label them with ARIA labels and things like that to make them readable. So that would be one of my pieces of feedback here if this were my site. Okay, let me, one kind of interesting gray area here is that if you're using a screen reader, so when I come to this site and I'm fully sighted, I can kind of take in a lot of this information at once. If I'm using a screen reader, it's much slower. And a lot of people who are practiced with it, they'll set it to like a pretty quick clip, which helps, but you still have to go through things one by one. So with labels and alt text and things like that, there's kind of a tension between wanting to provide as much context as possible while also letting people get through it quickly. So that's just kind of an interesting consideration. Okay. So one of the next things I would want to do is make sure that this site was sufficiently, oh, did you have something? Stretch it out. Had sufficient color contrast. If I take a look, do you guys see any areas that might be problems? Kind of looks okay to me. I already used another plugin called Color Contrast Analyzer to take a screenshot that then shows me what might be a second look. So this is what it kind of produces. It took a whole screen grab of the whole page and it darkened everything, and where color contrast is sufficient and I can set the level, it highlights things in white. So if I were looking at this, I might be curious about some of this text over here because it's a little bit spotty. This white outline is like very strong and I can read this. This is a little bit less. So my process here would be to figure out what colors we have going on here. John was using his developer tools in Chrome earlier. You right click on something and inspect. A lot of times you'll find your color over here, just easy like that. I have another tool pulled up here, just a website, where you can enter colors and find out if they meet certain criteria. AAA, by the way, is the highest level of compliance you can meet. It is very, very strict. So if my colors are this gray on a white background, I know that white is 6 Fs in a row. Okay, I see that that passes contrast standards for AA. Awesome. You can also see color contrast in context using some of the tools that John mentioned. So, for instance, Totally, I have that installed as well. Kind of hidden under my button there. Contrast. I don't have any problems. If I did, it would pop up down here as an option to see, so that's good. Another one, let me refresh the page, is called Wave. This is a pretty common tool. And it just recently got a facelift, actually. This was not quite as pretty as it is now. What both of those tools do is put labels superimposed on a site to show you where things are going well, where things are alerts, so kind of might be a problem, and then errors. And I see that if I'm only concerned with color contrast, I don't have anything to worry about here, but I do have some errors. So one linked image missing alt text. I see it's my little Instagram icon down there with no alternate text. So if I were tabbing through this with a screen reader, it would say something like icon maybe. Let's see. You can also tab into reference here. There's a few resources like this, which are awesome. Let me pull one up here. Okay, so that missing alt text, this will give you a ton of context for why it matters and how you can fix it, which is awesome. It will also link to the guideline in question. Okay, let's run through one more tool. This is integrated with developer tools as well. So John got to Chrome Lens this way. I'm gonna go to audits. And you can run with Lighthouse, which was an open source project. Now it's owned by Google, so that's why it's incorporated with Chrome so nicely. You can run all sorts of audits for performance, progressive web app. I'm obviously most interested in accessibility here. And I'll run an audit real quick on just this page. So I got an obviously very good score. What Lighthouse does is present a lot of the same information that we've talked about up to this point in a format that I find the most easy to use and the most easy to communicate with other team members. So I've got a shorthand score for how well it's doing, a 90, a green, everybody likes to see green. But then where there are problem areas, I can click into this and this one is the search icon I know. So it shows me the element that is missing a role or has an invalid role value. And I can hover over it and it will show it to me on the page. So Wave and Totally with superimposing things on the page can sometimes get a little bit messy and confusing. I like this. I can also export it as HTML. So this kind of view that you're seeing now, I can pull up in any web page, which is awesome for writing a report or writing up tickets, or as JSON, which is just the data that it's using to present this. Let me think. Ooh, there's also a tool, if you're familiar with NPM, there's an NPM package that will let you run a Lighthouse report in a batch. So we don't really want to, we're not interested in running these audits on, usually we're not interested in running audits on single pages like this. A user on the Spectrum website probably needs to go through a flow. Like we want them to be able to pay their bill. They're going to hit several pages in a row. We want to make sure that they're all accessible. So Lighthouse batch reporting will let me do that in one fell swoop. I won't have to navigate, run, navigate, run, navigate, run, which is cool. Ooh, go back to my slide here. I forgot that this was the plan. One other cool thing about Lighthouse is that you can run it from the command line, which means that I don't even have to navigate to the website myself. I can just pass it URL and tell my computer to go run Lighthouse. One thing that's cool to think about is this in the context of releasing software. So if we really want to bake in accessibility as an important piece in development, we can run a Lighthouse build and check for a certain score or check for certain issues before we say that it's been a successful build. So that kind of is an interesting way to think about things. We're not waiting to audit something, we are baking it into the delivery of our software. Any questions about all of that, tools and things?
Have you had any experience with a perfect Lighthouse score that still has issues?
I have not ever seen a perfect Lighthouse score actually.
Okay.
But
Okay, have
Sounds
you ever
like
seen
that.
that though, where somebody's made a perfect lighthouse score and then it was the least accessible site you've ever seen?
So they had ways of kind of hiding it. Yeah, so that is a good actually point, which is, the reason we want to use all these tools in conjunction with each other is because they give you sometimes different information. And it's nice to be able to compare them, and also in conjunction with our own knowledge of looking for things that might be problems, that the software can't find or it's hidden for some reason.
And back to what John said at the very beginning, to remember that none of these tools is perfect. And none of these tools is going to give you all the information.
Right. Yeah.
He did say something very similar.
I think I did.
Yes, you did.
I did have some wine.
Cool. Back to you.
So all these things, like, ideally would culminate into a wonderful world where we've maybe done all the right things and made all the right moves. But as I mentioned before, we do have old legacy projects that need to be updated, right? And so it's hard to just turn over a new leaf and without giving people reasons. And so while we try to do automation, we try to incorporate Lighthouse on a daily basis, because it's very easy to run Lighthouse. And then have it based off of also putting out new builds. We want to be able to reinforce that and give someone something tangible to consume in terms of accessibility issues. And so reporting is ultimately the goal at the end of it all, is to give somebody something to use and to turn around and go to maybe talk to the client, to go talk to the design team or the dev team, say, here's the report. These are the things that we're messing up. How do we fix them? And then go from there. So reporting is essential when we try to do any kind of testing or just try to be accessibility minded in the first place, because you want to be able to back up any type of red flags you run into. Okay, and so while Totally and Wave and Lighthouse do a good job of pointing that all out, we also want to be able to put it in a consumable report to benefit everybody, even after the fact. And it helps to create a really nice baseline and help us to scale and show improvement over time. Because if we can store those reports somewhere on the long term, then that's a marked indication of improvement. And so the one thing that we're going to talk about is WCAG actually provides a nice browser-based no, don't thank you yet. Down here. Oh, it opened up over here.
It's shy.
And baby. Yay, okay. So this is just easy to find. It's WCAG's general report. So it's all browser based. You can save it, you can export it, and you can come back to it later on. And so it gives you some breakdowns for how the tool works, but it's really just a whole bunch of text fields that are all browser based and generates a PDF or HTML report for you to save or to send off. And so, and it breaks it down into some very easy steps, and then goes through a lot of the process with you. And so it has a lot of optional fields, and with each one, almost each one, it will give you information as well to add context. And so it's very easy for someone to go through almost new and fresh and be able to generate a report just by following the information. As we mentioned before, the key point and ideally the best target is a AA compliance, which includes the core amount of the 2.0 standards. As Andy mentioned before, AAA can sometimes wind up compromising its own self in the idea of being accessible purely, right? We want to balance it out. And then A is probably not the goal you should shoot for. But you create some just basic text field input, and then you go through, and it helps you to set up your website and put information out there, because as you update your website, you want to be able to have screenshots as well, or snapshots of the data behind it. Next spot, it shows this spaces for examples. It's actually here you can add in all the URLs that you're going with. And then it goes into each of the guidelines of WCAG for AA and shows each of the standards that needs to be tested, and it gives you information on each of them. And then you can mark it as either not checked, passed, or failed, and you can give observations as well. And then it allows you also to put in other bits of information, but it goes through one guideline at a time, as of what you see on the checklist in front of you, to reinforce and make sure that you're covering your bases, or at least reporting on it as such. You go through all of that, and then you ultimately evaluate the website overall. It allows for documentation, and then again, overall concepts that are an issue. And then the out at the end of the rainbow, you can then produce a report, and then you can save it as HTML or as JSON as well. From there, it's store wherever you want to, put it along with your repo, attach it to a build if you want. But this makes it very easy for people to stand up a report system for accessibility as well. So that excuse that we don't have to go through all the paperwork to make sure that we're documenting everything. So there is a spot online that will allow you to document very quickly all things considered. So you take that little bit of complaining out of the way. Any questions on reporting? Oh, it's not working. Where is it working?
It's still on fire. There you go.
Okay, now thank you. All right, so the one big takeaway here is to keep in mind that when we talk about accessibility, it's only resource consuming and time consuming and money consuming when you don't put in the work across the board, right? By trying to invoke a sense of accessibility sensing throughout the whole development lifecycle, you can actually maintain and reduce costs because you just stem off any type of reworks in the first place. So something to keep in mind. So a couple of references. Most of the stuff is just found easily through W3C. They're the main ones that are trying to spearhead a lot of the accessibility initiatives. And then from there, just go down a rabbit hole and give yourself some time, right? So thank you guys again for all your time and hanging out with us. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, John.
Does anyone have any questions? We wanted to kind of spend a little bit of the rest of the time doing an open discussion and forum on accessibility. I know we have a couple of people that have very big opinions on it, and I'm glad that they showed up. So if you guys want to talk about it, go there. I did have a couple of cues over here as well to kind of help with the conversations. Those on the recording, I don't think we'll be able to see it. But the first one was the idea like, what is your disability? And so I'll call back again to my brother and I who have just corrective lenses. That's a disability, right? Being unable to focus on something, even in a minor capacity, is also a disability. It's just a question of severity. It's a question of duration, right? The other topic was how long are you willing to wait for a page to load, right? This is actually more interesting with the implications of adopting a more inverted mindset with accessibility, is that by improving your accessibility scope with web development, you actually also benefit in terms of search engine optimization. Because when web crawlers are crawling through your websites, they're gonna be looking for links that are clear, they're looking for clear organization, and they're looking for alt labels. Those all affect how your website is rated. And so if you want to do something immediately to improve your brand reach, doing accessibility also makes sense in that regard as well. And then the final conversation topic is, when did technology fail you last? A couple people who got angry. Mine today was probably just my wireless on my laptop. I always had to turn it off and on because it likes to prioritize over a hard line and just causes problems. So you can always trust the machines. What do you want to do?
We can just hang
Hang
out for
out.
a while. Yeah.
We need to stop the recording?
Thank you. I think we
Or do
can
you
stop
wanna
the recording,
include
but
any-
I just wanted to ask you a question. It's more general. I don't know if you can actually answer it, but maybe you guys have some opinions. So if you want to make the website fully accessible, how do you balance that design, those design ideas that are appealing and are nice and are all dynamic and everything looks with, at the same time being accessible?
Keeping the client happy. So that was one of the questions we kind of anticipated. The idea of like trying to introduce instant feedback in all parts of the development lifecycle makes it very easy for the whole shop, the whole team, to say no earlier before it becomes a concept, an idea, or an ask that gets too massive for you to say no to, right? And so if a client maybe comes with an idea that you think is really cool, you're like, that is really cool, but if your team is equipped to say that's not accessible, or that's not gonna provide a really good, robust user experience, you can nip it in the bud right before it becomes a full-on ticket, a full-on feature, and a full-on epic in your development. And so trying to be proactive, the key is engaging all parts of the lifecycle so that any point of attack, if you will, there will be someone there to defend choices in the right direction.
I do feel like too, alternate text and ARIA labels and things like that can do a whole lot in terms of like providing an alternate way to experience things. Like, you know, with videos, it mentions in the criteria having maybe a text like description of what happens in the video. So you can do a lot to try to make experiences that you might not even, might seem difficult to make accessible on the face of them, at least have an alternative way of knowing what's there on the page.
Any other opinions or thoughts on that? Sylvan.
I wanted to say something very personal opinion because in your presentation you mentioned disability more like an objective, how would I say, an objective opinion. But to me, to my mind, disability can also be analyzed as something subjective because, for example, when I take my case, when I open a website, I have difficulties distinguishing content when it's in flashy colors, in the flashy background, like for example, yellow or red. So I don't know if it's the same for other people, or would you also consider that as a disability? I know some people can be comfortable with that, but usually the website color has to appeal to the majority of people, so they have to use some colors that are not too contrasted. So for me, usually when I open a website like that, I just go away. I don't even keep doing what I wanted to do because I feel like I would have to concentrate too much to read, and I have headaches. So maybe it's a disability to me, but I don't know how you consider that.
I think that all that comes off of a really probably negative paradigm, right? The general idea when it comes to accessibility is much like congressional debate, like the majority is represented, but the minority is protected, right? And so while maybe the overall website is supposed to be catered towards a majority of consumers that come in, the moment that you walk away from the website, that's also the time that you may come to a talk about accessibility and bring it up to now a pool of people, right? Who will then talk about it later on. And so trying to dismiss or try to minimize the fact that you're gonna lose one user is horrible business practice, right? We don't wanna do that. So instead of trying to internalize the feeling whether or not you have a disability, it's better to kind of apply the lens of, is it causing you to not experience the website as a developer is intended? If that happens, then that is a failing on the development process. And that while it may not always be a hard standard within the guidelines, it will feed into it somehow and in some way. And so a lot of the ways that you consume, whether it's flashing lights or something that can be exhaustive to you visually, those are disabilities, although they may not be one of the overly protected ones, right? That's not the point. The point is that you, as a consumer, are being deterred from going to that website. And chances are you're not the only one, right? Especially in the digital age where people are constantly focused at a certain distance on monitors, getting exhausted, like eye strain, is a thing, right? Although we may not call it a disability, again, come back to that stat about 1 billion people having disabilities. That is understated because a lot of people, including yourself, are really questioning whether or not you have a disability. It's like if it's disabling your ability to consume a website, then that's enough, right? And we should probably offer ways to just disable certain animations, certain color styles, right? Does that seem fair? Does that make sense? Anyone else with input on that?
I've seen websites that, have the buttons where you can increase the font size and decrease the font size. And it's really nice to be able to have that option. But recently I saw a site that actually did for color blindness buttons as well, which was kind of cool. My husband's colorblind, so he appreciates that.
And it stands out right now because it's new, right? And it's something that we probably should have been doing out of the gate.
Yeah.
But now you know it's here. And so that, yeah, it leads to a positive brand experience when you do that. The Pixel 4 came out with a whole accessibility suite, including live like captioning. And it just listens to ambient noise and tries to do its best to log conversations going on. That's awesome. And those things are starting to become more prevalent now. Then companies are not waiting for there to be fire before they start to fireproof their stuff. And that's important.
That's actually great. When I'm thinking about accessible software and actually not just the software, but the hardware as well. I'm thinking about the fact that actually when all of these things just came out and all of the software started being developed, most of the users were young people, and so it's the majority of the users. And there is not very much, there are not very many users that are of that age, like 80s, 90s. And when this generation that is just so tied to use software and all the gadgets for their daily lives, when we grow to that age, there are a lot of things that are probably we won't be able to do any other way other than just open a website. I don't know if can you pay all the bills over the phone somehow? Or because I'm not sure. Some
companies charge extra money to use the phone now.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can't pay Netflix over the phone.
Yeah, I remember when I was trying to, when you were talking about all different types of like temporary disability, I couldn't make a payment over the phone with a voice recognition system because my accent was so terrible. And I was yelling at it because it just wouldn't understand my accent. And so I just had to get better at it at some point. But no, it's gotten a lot better.
Yeah, and so that's
All
more
of
of like
it's getting
a
better.
cultural disability, right? Like you have an accent. That is sometimes where we have some type of initiative to try to compensate for accessibility, that we wind up kind of switching one problem for another, right? We allow some people now to use their voice to navigate, but now we may have given up some customer bases that have accents or that can't speak. I was looking at this, the middle prompt here. It seems like the longest people will wait is 2.7 seconds for a website.
Seems like an eternity though.
It does.
If it doesn't
Right.
load immediately, I'm almost like, it's not because of any disability I have, maybe it's because of a character disability, but I don't wait around for more than a second or two. If it doesn't load, I find myself like, what the hell is going on? Like,
Hey, you hit refresh, it's only made the
Right.
problem worse.
or take
right?
it off of Wi-Fi to go on the cell signal, if Wi-Fi isn't working, and that delays the process. Yeah, little things we do sometimes to make it worse. Just
Yeah.
wait for a second.
The reason why I brought that one up is because of the circumstantial idea of being in a rural environment where your internet speed may not be the greatest. And if you have a notification that says, hey, are you still there? We're gonna log you out soon. And you have really, really bad internet, and maybe it takes forever for that notification to pop up, but it's counting, right? By the time it shows up, you try to interact with it and it's already kicked you off your current session. So that's just one of those implications that affects people that don't necessarily have a disability. It's just circumstantial. Any other questions or input? Thank you guys this was a long one, so. After she stops the recording, then we'll do karaoke.